Welcome to this chess video, everyone. This one will be going over perhaps the most famous game by this Grandmaster. And so this game was played in 1969 on his road to the Grandmaster title. And this was actually the first game that I've ever seen from this person. But it really left an impact on me, and so I thought it was definitely worth sharing in a YouTube video. Now, a lot of times they kind of poke fun sometimes at, how to pronounce some of these chess player last names. I think for simplicity in this video, if I go by names, I'll just call him Roman. I think people can probably forgive me for that. I think my best attempt at pronouncing his last name is Dzindzichashvili. But like I said, I think I'll just stick with Roman for this video. Okay, so in this game, his opponent actually starts with pawn to e4. He plays pawn to e5. We have knight f3, knight c6, all pretty standard stuff. And then we have the Ruy Lopez opening. Now here's where things start to get a little interesting, because he plays bishop to c5, still mainline theory, about to change very shortly. There's pawn to c3, and now you would probably expect something like knight f6, possibly knight g to e7 instead. But instead of both of these ideas, we have the really aggressive looking pawn to f5. This is actually still opening theory. Perhaps it's not too surprising because very similar to Sicilian, it almost feels like every single opening move for the first two moves just so happens to be theory. This is an opening really well studied. But the idea with this one is a little bit interesting. Of course, Black's king is very exposed, especially on this diagonal. Kind of reminiscent to the King's Gambit. But there's a little bit of trickery here, because if White were to take this pawn, which objectively is best by the way, it's not actually such a clear position, because here Black can actually push the pawn forward on the knight, and the best move according to the engine is actually pawn to d4. You give up the knight on f3, they get the bishop, you can take on g2, push the rook over to g1, and then Black will try and continue developing. Now this isn't as clear as it looks, because long term, White is probably going to win this pawn, and likely end up a pawn up. But as Black, they have some nice piece development, the fact that they can castle very quickly, and maybe they could argue that White's doubled pawns on the c-file and doubled pawns on the f-file might be justification for trying this. Objectively speaking, it's only about half a pawn better in White's favor. It's probably not going to be played too often today, but it's definitely tricky enough as a gambit. And as we'll see with this game, it really worked out in Roman's favor. Now back to the game, rather than taking there, and trading so far into what looks like almost an endgame, here we have pawn to d5. So now Black will actually capture on e4, and if you take on c5, then very similar to what we looked at, they'll take on f3. So White tries to make an improvement here, and what they play is knight to g5, with the obvious idea that they might recapture this pawn this way, and Black probably has to address this bishop. Now Roman finds the top engine move of bishop back to b6, and now White plays pawn to d5. The computer is a bit materialistic and trying to just get back to material, claiming that knight captures e4 is best. But d5 is a fine move as well. And so now we have a really interesting pawn to e3. We were under the threat of knight captures e4, winning the pawn back, so why not advance the pawn and give it up in a more favorable way? If White were to ever capture here on e3, we could have something like this here, but then rather than capture back on e3, they can throw in this move, knight to e6, and now if the queen moves, you're threatening the fork on c7. Very tricky position. And if instead you try and take the knight, then they'll capture this way, queens will come off, and then there's this discovered attack on the king, which is going to be way too dangerous, as White's threatening to also win the rook with promotion. And so for that, they're going to have to get their king out of danger, and that means they're going to lose the bishop here on e3. Material will be equal and will be kind of a tricky position. Something like this. Complicated as it was, actually kind of looks really more like an endgame. But that's a lot of interesting stuff that went kind of deeply, and perhaps the players didn't really like where that was headed. And so here instead, White plays capturing the knight, and now there's this capture back. The engine actually likes throwing in the in-between move first, of capturing f2 because it is with check, forcing the king over, and then capturing here on c6. But the game continued, where now this knight is under attack, and so rather than move the knight, Roman's Grandmaster opponent here decides to play pawn to h4. And now we have the capture on f2, king is over to f1, and now we get kind of closer to what was really starting to impress me in this game. Material is equal right now, Black is about to win this bishop here on b5. I think it's probably safe enough to play the move, but I will say that in this position you have to be aware of White's dangerous looking threat if pawn captures this bishop. So if you want, you can pause the video and see what is the problem if black captures that bishop. What does white have that looks like it could win more material? Okay, so hopefully you got that worked out by now. If not, the idea was that if this bishop is captured, now white has queen to d5. And although black has just taken the bishop, white is now threatening to win the rook. And you can't actually save the rook in time, because if you try saving the rook, then you'll checkmate here. And so basically you have to give up more material than what you were actually bargaining for. Now the only way that this really works is if you can see a way that you can stop the checkmate threat and give up the rook favorably. And that's exactly what Roman finds here, which he had to have, I'm sure, seen before capturing this bishop. So the game continued with knight to h6, of course defending against the dangerous checkmate threat. And so now, of course, white has to really play capturing the rook, the only real testing move. If he were to instead try something like bringing the knight back to e4, black is simply better because they can advance their knight, this pawn is defended, and black will be still up material, up 3 points. So really the only testing line is for white to capture the rook. But now here comes pawn to c6. Very casual move. It looks like we're actually very close to trapping the queen. In long term, at the very least, you can probably castle, move your queen out of the way, maybe get the bishop out of the way, and then the rook is probably going to win the queen. But all of that is actually pretty time consuming, and in the process, you're probably going to give up the rook for the queen. Which is okay, but it's only a gain of 4 points of material, and we have to keep in mind that white is already up by 2. So really the material imbalance won't be that large, compared to as if they'd just lost the queen. So now we have knight to e4 by white. Black continues with the idea of castling, which is still a good move because king safety is very important, but also the fact that this rook is now adding extra support to this pawn, which also frees up this bishop. May or may not be relevant, but it's just useful to do. It also might prepare something like pawn advancing to f1 if the king ever moves, and then on the promotion you have this rook on f8 that could recapture on f1. White has to try and keep up the pressure somehow, if not their queen will probably get trapped. They played bishop to g5, which is a fine move. The engine slightly prefers capturing this knight. I can show that line real briefly, where if they capture this knight here, then black has many good moves, one of them simply being pawn to d5, kicking this knight back, and then something like queen to f6. You're now threatening the bishop while keeping your pawn structure, and you don't really have time to save your bishop with something like bishop to d2, because then white can play queen g6, attacking this knight, and if they move the knight back, then you can attack the knight again while finally getting a discovered attack on their queen. But you really don't have to see that deeply in this line to really understand the fact that white is actually in trouble here, and black is doing well. It's just a matter of time before they can close in and actually win the trapped queen. But here in the gaming set, we have something much more dramatic. I'll let you pause the video, see if you can figure it out, and then I'll share what I was thinking. Okay, now the move that I was thinking here, at least my very first instinct, was just simply try and get the queen out of the way, right? Queen e8, maybe queen c7. I was thinking queen c7, just because it's more natural to get the queen off the back rank. And then, of course, we're threatening to bring the bishop here, and it looks like we're probably trapping their queen. The problem with this is I'm actually missing a very key idea that white has. That idea is simply bishop to e7. My rook has to leave, and as soon as the rook moves, now they have bishop d6, and all of a sudden white is actually winning, not black. White is still up 2 points of material, and this queen has to really move embarrassingly backwards. Something like queen to d8, but now we see the kind of the problem, right? This, rook is not particularly well placed, and there isn't really much stopping white from getting all their pieces active. They could play something like rook h3, swing the rook over to somewhere like d3 long term. This knight has no problems developing, and this rook is going to get into the game. White has all the time in the world to do this, and they're up by 2 points in the meantime. Problem for black is their development is really tricky. This queen doesn't have too many squares because of how really well the knight is guarding those squares, and this knight is very difficult to kick away. You can't push it because the pawn is already blocked by the bishop, and we've already given up the f-pawn, as you recall with the pawn f5 early in the game. So really, black actually has some trouble untangling here, and their development becomes a real problem. White's queen might be out of play temporarily, but black's troubles actually gives white compensation, and according to the engine, white is actually slightly better in this position. And this knight can't be touched, the bishop is just anchored really well, and really it's a difficult game from here. I don't know about anyone else, but I would not feel too comfortable playing this position against a Grandmaster. So what was better than that? Perhaps you found the improvement that's even better than what my move was. Real spectacular idea. You take the initiative and you just play pawn to b4. Yes, it is a queen sacrifice here, but now you see the very dangerous problem. Worse than that, because if they were to take the queen, I'll show you're not actually just winning the queen, because after this check, there is actually nothing guarding this white king here. The only thing that white can do is just helplessly block with something. In this case, the only legal move is pawn to c4, and then bishop captures c4 is actually checkmate. His opponent ended up resigning. It's just simply a lost position. It's either give up the queen on c8, which of course is silly, or it's to just play the knight b to d2. That way when there's this check, you can block this way and the knight defends the pawn. But in this case too, you're just simply losing the queen as we mentioned, and it's very little to no chance that white is going to win against a fellow Grandmaster when they're down 7 points of material. And also what I found really inspirational about this game as well, is that like I said, this game was from 1969, which was 9 years before he ended up reaching his peak rating. And if he was this good and continued to get even better over the next 9 years, it just shows you how much there is to learn in chess. And the real inspiration, which I find even layering upon that, is that at least the time of this video, in 2024, Roman's actually 80 years old, and according to his FIDE page, he's currently rated, as of this month, 2550, which is only 45 points away from his all-time peak. So don't really let people discourage you by saying that you're too old to learn chess, or that somehow chess is extremely age-dependent. I know too many people get discouraged saying, oh, I should have learned chess sooner, or you have to start super young to get really good. And even if these players most often do learn really young, it doesn't mean that adults cannot make progress afterwards. As I've commonly said, Mikhail Tal, one of the best known attackers, actually reached his peak rating at age 44. So by no means is age as important as many people make it out to be. Hope this video was insightful for everyone, and you enjoyed this chess game as much as I have. Thanks for stopping by. I'll see you in the next chess video.